the prices of this land was incredibly cheap. The first 20 families that accepted Pagan's deal would receive 150 acres of land, plus an additional 50 acres of land per child in the family, at 6 pence sterling per acre, which was a great price at that time. In fact, many would assume it would be too good to be true. But the reality of it was, this was pretty much the only chance that many of them had, so naturally many took the deal. The following 20 families would receive the same amount of land, but for 1 shilling per acre, so the price would increase the longer you waited. Once Pagan had rounded up a sufficient amount of Scottish settlers, he was then put in charge of rounding up enough food for these people. After all, a voyage across the ocean would be a very long and tenuous voyage. He was put in charge of finding enough food for 12 weeks. While most voyages wouldn't last 12 weeks, they could be as short as a month at times. You never knew how long you were going to be at sea. And with a boatload of people, you had to be sure that you could feed them. Now, as for the exact number of people aboard the Hector, historians argue this fact. Some say there was 179, others say there were 189, but you can roughly imagine there'd be close to 200 people aboard. Now, many would probably be thinking that this was too good to be true. Pagan had brought to them a fantastic deal that would basically help them escape the tragedies that had befallen them in Scotland, and many of them would be right to think so. What Pagan didn't mention to these people was that the only reason they were being offered the land was because the Philadelphia Company couldn't attract enough New Englanders to come. So, with having all of this land that they couldn't settle, they were forced to go elsewhere to find people to bring over. Naturally, they chose Scotland. Unfortunately for the Scottish people, this fact was not the only one Pagan refused to mention, and it was not the only embellishment he threw into the proposal. Now, I'd like to stop for a second and just talk about the Hector itself. The Hector was a very old Dutch ship. It had seen its days across the sea. Traveling back in the 1700s was very different in comparison to traveling across the sea or across anywhere now. To put it in perspective, a flight from Glasgow, the capital of Scotland, to the capital of Canada, Ottawa, would last roughly 15 hours, and you'd have your natural accommodations, you'd have a comfortable chair, and you would have a flight attendant bringing you your food, and it'd be relatively calm and quiet. Now, traveling aboard the Hector, different story. You had roughly 200 people crammed into a boat roughly the size of a slave ship that would be used in future generations to bring over slaves from Africa to the Americas. Now, there was obviously no plumbing aboard the ship. They had buckets, so I'll let you figure out what exactly these buckets were used for. The hull inside the Hector was, to put it mildly, a nightmare. Try and imagine taking your entire family, everyone you know, and cramming them into a very, very small place. Now, bring in the smell of tar, vomit, and other extremities into the area. So basically imagine the smell of a public bathroom at all times. Now, try and imagine having a bunch of small children aboard the Hector. There were approximately 30 of them under the age of 2 running around at the same time. So now you have a horrible smell, a horrible sound, and no escape aboard a small ship. And you knew you were going to be aboard that ship for a very long time. And who knew what could happen? You were going to be out at sea for a long time. There was no turning around. Now, just when you probably thought things couldn't possibly get much worse, they did. Smallpox struck about halfway through the voyage. Now, smallpox usually hits hardest on the youngest and the oldest, and in this case it was no different. 18 children died aboard the Hector due to smallpox, and you couldn't do anything about this. There was going to be no one capable of curing such a disease at this time. To get rid of the bodies, because you couldn't keep them aboard the ship, the decay alone would cause even more disease, they threw them overboard. They performed burials at sea. This usually involved wrapping the body in a sheet and then just simply throwing them overboard, paying your last respects. This would be a heartbreaking thing, but trust me, it was far from the last thing that would happen to these poor people. Eventually, the people aboard the Hector landed in Pictou, Nova Scotia on September 15th. The area around where they landed was settled already by English-speaking people, French-speaking people. There were a few Dutch in the area, and while there were a few Scottish people, they were by far the minority. This was a very, very big problem for these people, as the people aboard the Hector, coming from Scotland, could hardly speak English. In fact, there might have been 4 people aboard the entire ship that could speak English. The rest spoke Gaelic, which is an entirely different language from English. Now, if I could just backtrack for a few minutes, you might remember I mentioned a man called John Pagan. John Pagan was the man responsible for advertising this land to the Scottish people and basically promoting this wonderful place for them to come to. As you might recall, I mentioned that it was supposed to be perfect for growing oats and raising cattle and was close to shore so water would be nearby. Well, as it turns out, John Pagan lied through his teeth. The land which the Scottish people were provided was not even cleared. Now, to the people of the Scottish Highlands, this would be a nightmare in itself. Many of these people had never even seen an axe, so they would hardly even know what to do. This land that was given to them had to be cleared, and it had to be removed of all things in the area before they could even start farming. This was basically a forest in waiting for them. The land that they were provided was also miles away from shore, much farther than they expected. So if they were in need of water, had to go close to the shore at any point in time, it would be another tedious activity in itself. Their first few years in Canada, their first especially, I should say, were terrible. The weather in Canada is considerably colder than that of Scotland. In Scotland, you would have somewhat of a fall temperature at all times, whereas in Canada, the winters, as many of you listening would probably know, are exceptionally cold. As a result, many of them were unprepared for this. After the first year, many actually left this settlement to go elsewhere. They saw there was no point to living in this area. Those who chose to stay stood out the terrible weather, and with the help of natives, locals, and perhaps a bit of blind luck, survived through living in the winters of Canada. After all, there are still people with Scottish heritage here, so obviously they didn't just give up and quit. Now, at this point, some of you might be wondering, is this the worst immigration story ever? Well, in that case, no. As you may recall, there are other stories that have happened in the past where more atrocious events have happened. For example, scurvy struck instead, or other calamities along the way. So, in that respect, no, it's not the worst story. But it's the fact that these people survived it and lived through all these terrible events and still managed to pull through in the end. So, in this regard, if you are of Scottish heritage, you should be proud of who you came from and know that these people managed to do all these things in their lifetime. So, with that concludes my presentation on the Hector. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I hope that you learned something. If you are of Scottish heritage, perhaps you learned something about maybe someone in your family that you didn't know before. And even if you're not of Scottish heritage, if you can take one thing away from this, it's that the next time you find yourself traveling, whether it be on a plane or just on a road trip, take heart in knowing that your voyage, no matter how long or strenuous it might be, it is nowhere near as bad as what these people had to endure. So just remember that next time. Thank you very much for listening.